right, good morning. We'll get started this portion of the Memorial Day observances. I'm Don Corey with Bedford Historical Society, and have a few remarks about the old burying ground here. This old burying ground dates to the town's incorporation in 1729. It's a major contributing element to our old Bedford Center Historic District. We believe that over 1,400 of Bedford's earliest founders, leaders, other citizens were buried in this 1-acre parcel over all the years that interment took place. However, the gravestones and tombs only contain 496 names. All the other burials are unmarked. The oldest marked grave is that of Catherine Lane, who died at age 39 in 1731. After Shawsheen Cemetery opened on the east side of town, the old burying ground was neglected for many years. However, in recent years, community preservation funds, matched by grants from the Mass Historical Commission, were used to repair and reset many of the gravestones and to restabilize our tombs. Bob Selecta had then organized a crew to clean moss, lichens, and dirt off the gravestones so that some of the old slate monuments are now almost as legible as when they were new. Only the marble gravestones have deteriorated badly from air pollution. Among those buried here in marked graves are 43 soldiers of the Revolutionary War, including 3 black soldiers. 2 other Revolutionary veterans, 1 a black soldier, were originally buried here but were reinterred in Shawsheen Cemetery after it opened. And of those buried here, 34 were members of the Bedford Militia and Minutemen companies that answered the alarm at Concord on April 19, 1775. They include Minuteman Captain Jonathan Wilson, the only Bedford soldier killed in action that day, and militiaman Joe Blaine, the 4th generation in the family, who was badly wounded that day. A boulder straight back with a bronze plaque that was installed in honor of Joe. Solomon Stearns and Reuben Bacon, who were teenagers that answered the Concord alarm, are also buried here. Both died in service within a month. Disease which cost as many lives in that era before vaccines caused as many deaths as combat. They are also buried here. Well, the existence of both militia and Minuteman companies at Bedford at that time is puzzling to some people. But the Minuteman Company actually had just been raised in March of 1775, shortly before the alarm, in response to a call from the Provincial Congress to enroll all able-bodied men. However, from early days, England had required towns to have militias to defend themselves. Bedford had provided officers and soldiers for expeditions from the time of its incorporation, primarily during all the French and Indian Wars up to about 1763. Familiar names: John Page, Hugh Maxwell, Josiah Fassett, all received commissions from various governors. Several individuals, John Abbott, Nathaniel Merriam, served and died at Lake George in 1756 and 58. And during the French and Indian Wars. And Brown's History of Bedford lists a number of familiar Bedford family names of men who served and a few that died. And those were during the Majesty's service prior to the Revolution. Most of them are all buried here. But when the Revolutionary War broke out, Bedford already then had some of these men who had training in arms and provided leadership. Eleazar Davis, another soldier who's buried here, was one of those men. During his service in the French and Indian Wars, he'd been issued a Brown Bess musket by the British, standard issue. Later, Eleazar Davis, served as 2nd lieutenant in Bedford's militia company, and of course he used his musket against the British. The musket had been donated to the Historical Society in modern times, but regrettably it was stolen during a break-in the 1960s and never recovered. But The legacy of these pre-revolutionary soldiers should not be overlooked. Some of them were still young enough to serve again in the Revolution, and their contributions undoubtedly were valuable in our fight for independence. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I'm Captain Jim Ringland of the Bedford Minutemen, the modern Bedford Minuteman Company. As Don has explained, a large contingent of the Bedford militia and minute companies responded on April 19th. As a matter of fact, it was the largest contingent to reach the bridge. It's 77 members. I'd like to commemorate right now, as you see from the plaque beside me, those 43 soldiers who are interred here at the old burying ground. Captain Moses Abbott, Mr. Moses Abbott Jr., Mr. Abijah Bacon, Mr. Elijah Bacon, John Bacon, Mr. Oliver Bacon, Reuben Bacon, Thompson Bacon Esquire, Lieutenant Eleazar Davis, Mr. David Fitch, Jeremiah Fitch Jr., Mr. John Fitch, Deacon Moses Fitch, Mr. Joseph Hartwell, Caesar Jones, Timothy Jones Esquire, Mr. David Lane, Mr. James Lane III, Job Lane, Mr. John Lane, Mr. John Lane Jr., Mr. Samuel Lane, the second Mr. Samuel Lane, Mr. Solomon Lane, Stephen Lane, Mr. William Maxwell, Cambridge Moore, Captain John Moore, Mr. Ebenezer Page, Mr. Nathaniel Page, Mr. William Page, Mr. Matthew Pollard, Oliver Pollard Jr., Caesar Prescott, Captain David Reed, Mr. Oliver Reed, Oliver Reed, Captain Edward Stearns, Mr. Solomon Stearns, Captain John Weber, Captain Jonathan Wilson, Mr. Jonathan Wilson, and Deacon James Wright.
My pleasure now to introduce Mr. Terrence Parker, who will talk about the black soldiers' contributions.
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out in this drizzle. It shows the respect that you all have for our fallen soldiers. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Irving Smith in the crowd. Tall gentleman right there. He's one of the founding members of the Concerned Black Citizens of Bedford. It's a now defunct group, but it's a very important group here in Bedford, and every year CBCB would have one of its members come up and read this remembrance, and it's on their shoulders, the shoulders of those CBC members, of which I stand. And so it's always an honor every year for me to just point out that in the northeast corner, right over there, of the old burial grounds, are the remains of Caesar Jones, Cambridge Moore, and Caesar Prescott. They are three former slaves who fought for the freedom of the colonies in the Revolutionary War. Although there's no official record, family tradition has it that Cambridge Moore and Caesar Jones accompanied their masters on April 19, 1775, to the skirmish at the North Bridge in Concord, which marked the beginning of the American Revolution. In Abraham E. Brown's, quote, History of Bedford, end quote, he states, "It is noticeable that 3 Negroes, relics of the days of slavery in this town, not registered as liable to do military duty, were in the Continental Army during the greater part of the war: Cambridge Moore, Caesar Prescott, and Caesar Jones. Up until 1780, Jones, Moore, and Prescott served in the Army without pay, as they were enslaved. However, with the adoption of the state constitution in 1783, slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. As the war lengthened and reenlistments became necessary, 2 out of the 3 former slaves re-entered the Army in 1780 as free men. They received the same bounty and pay as their white neighbors. For re-enlisting for 3 years, Cambridge Moore and Caesar Prescott were each paid, get this, 20 head of cattle. In 1782, in answer to another call for soldiers, Caesar Jones also re-enlisted. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the ceremony here at the Old Burying Ground, and we will proceed to Mudge Way for the continuation of the observances.
Mm.